Hello and welcome to Out of India Theory. Hope you guys are doing well. In today's episode, I have with me Dr. Jeffrey Tarrant, who is a licensed psychologist and board certified in neurofeedback. He is director of Psychic Mind Science and the Neuro Meditation Institute. He is also the author of a couple of books, Becoming Psychic, Lessons from the Minds of Mediums, Healers, and Psychics, and Meditation Interventions to Rewire the Brain. Dr. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me.
I actually came across your name and your work first when I watched this podcast called the Telepathy Tapes. And I had I had a chat with Dr. Diane Powell from that series. And then after that, I've been wanting to talk to more people who are involved in this, and I think we got connected, and then I'm really happy that you're on the podcast and we can have this chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
So first of all, I just want to ask you, there is this urban myth out there that most human beings use just 10% of their brains. And if we use more than that, then we would be able to unlock our true potential. Is that really true? What do you think?
I like the way you set it up, calling it an urban myth. I don't know where that came from. Maybe the idea is that we're not using our full potential, which I would say that's true. We're not using our full potential. I think that's pretty clear. But the idea that we're only using 10% of our brains, that really doesn't even make any sense. We know that the brain is very much focused on efficiency.
Right.
And it doesn't do things that aren't being used. It's very much a use it or lose it system. If you don't use things, it gets rid of it because it's very expensive in terms of energy to run systems that you're not using. So literally, we're using all of our brain.
Right.
But I don't necessarily think we're tapping into our full potential.
Right. I always understood that question as, I don't know if this is still valid in psychology today, but then how people would map function to certain areas of the brain, and then I guess at some point they found, please correct me if I'm wrong, they found that the brain is actually more plastic than that, and then it kind of reassigns functions to different closely associated groups. But then if you go by functions with certain, associated with certain groups of cells, I thought maybe they saw that certain areas of the brain lit up during certain functions, and then maybe they thought, there are certain areas which are never activated, and so maybe we never use them. I guess that was the rationale behind it.
I don't know if that was the rationale or not, but again, if you're looking at the brain, there's no areas that are never active.
Okay.
There's the brain is very busy, and at times it's more busy than others. I don't actually know where that idea came. Again, I think the only way that I can make sense of it is that somebody was looking at it and saying, we have much more potential than we actually use. And I think the mistake was connecting that to the brain, because at least for me, I see a difference between the mind and the brain.
Right.
And so if we think of it that way, then, if we say, we're only using 10% of our mind, I could maybe make an argument for that. Or we only access 10% of our mind or whatever, however you want to frame that. That makes more sense to me. And so maybe that was the confusion, right? Of kind of linking those two things together and saying they're the same thing.
Right. I'm happy you brought up the difference between both, because, and I want to pick your brains on this, because a lot of people conventionally, long time in the past, they thought consciousness and the mind was like an emergent phenomenon. It's it comes out of biochemical processes in the tissue of the brain and perhaps other neural cells of the body. But then it's kind of not really what Eastern mysticism and the rest of, ancient civilizations believed. It's the other way around, consciousness is like the primal stuff that makes up stuff, and then everything sort of solidifies out of it. So where does modern science, and you personally, where do you stand on this? Is it something, because you study the brain, you study consciousness and meditation and everything, so what's your take on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. We still don't have a firm answer from a scientific perspective. And in fact, I'm sure you saw that last year, the year before, where, those researchers, they had a bet going on for 25 years. And one of them was betting that by the time we hit whatever year it was, 2024, we would solve the problem of consciousness and we would understand how the brain creates consciousness. And, that research had to basically say, okay, I lose. We don't understand this. We don't understand how it works. And so, that's the hard problem of consciousness, they call it, right? That it's like, how does consciousness arise from this, several pound, sack of fat that's sitting in our brains or sitting in our skull, right? Like it doesn't make sense. We don't understand how that works. And so then there are more and more researchers now who are saying, well, maybe the ancients had it right. Maybe consciousness is not something that arises from the brain, but is something out there. And that the brain is more of an antenna or a filter that takes that information from the field, whatever you want to call it, source, and then translates it. And to me, that makes way more sense. I mean, actually, I think we could probably argue that both have pieces of truth, because of course, if you injure a part of the brain, you lose certain functionality, typically.
Right.
And so, that makes an easy argument that it's like, well, the brain is causing certain things. And that may be true, right? But again, I don't think that answers kind of the bigger questions of our experience. How do you explain our experience? And we can't, just by looking at the brain alone.
Yeah, yeah. So how does one, I mean, as a professional psychologist and maybe as a meditation teacher, and we'll get into that a little later, how do you approach this? Because I read an article in Psychology Today where you said that scientific inquiry goes by methodology and not believability, So what kind of a methodology can you, because when I look at consciousness, it's like this substratum of all that we know. Everything that we know and possibly can experience the world is through consciousness alone. If it wasn't there, we wouldn't be aware of anything. And somehow that factor, which is so like right under your nose, is never built into any equation anywhere. So how do you study that,
Yeah, good question. And I think that's something that we're wrestling with right now. And you're starting to see some changes in the way that researchers are approaching this. And, I think part of it is looking at, kind of like we just said, looking at people's experiences and saying, okay, these are people's experiences. These are valid as data points by themselves. Whereas what we've done in the past is said, well, somebody's experience, that doesn't count for anything. If I can't measure it, if I can't, stick it in the lab and repeat it, then it doesn't exist. But that doesn't even make sense, because we know that people have certain experiences, and I'm sure Dr. Powell talked about this, right? Like with savant syndrome.
Yeah.
We know that's real. We know that certain people have these just amazing abilities with math or arts or music or whatever. We don't understand how it works, but it's real. We can see it. And so I think for me, one of the things that's important is really looking at people's experiences and using those as data points and saying like, no, this is what's happening. We may not have an explanation for it yet. And this is what I think I was kind of getting at with the idea of methodology versus belief, in that, a lot of researchers, they will get sort of rigid in their belief structures, that it's like, no, this is what we understand. This is how we understand the world to work. And anything that's outside of that can't exist. It's impossible. And so therefore, there's no reason to look at it. Right. And, so that's a belief, and in fact, you could almost see that as a religion, that they've turned science into a religion, that, I don't care what you say, this is the truth.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, wait a minute, hang on a minute. As scientists, aren't we supposed to explore? We're supposed to look at unanswered questions and look at people's odd experiences and say, how does this make sense, right? Like what's going on here? And even if we don't understand it, to report on it, and to report on it as clearly and accurately as we can.
I came across this word recently that I've been using a lot more often, is scientism. Scientism is this dogmatic view of science, of how it should be and how it must be, and it's kind of a rigid kind of a view. But then one of the cornerstones of scientific inquiry, of course, is reproducibility and repeatability and so on. And I remember one of my first encounters with psychic phenomena and ESP research was, I don't know if this scientist called J.B. Rhine. and
Yeah.
he used something called, I don't know, what are they called, Zener cards, like these little cards that people would predict and all that, and then he would calculate the probability and stuff. And I
Yeah.
guess it was always frustrating in that it was never consistent or reproducible. Like some people were able to do it sometimes on some occasions, but not all the time, but not all the people. So this is like maddening. Except people who were like monks or those who were like trained, in meditation and all these modalities, maybe qigong or whatever, they definitely seem to stand out in their ability to wield such powers. So I want to quickly get your opinion on that because you are the director of something called Neuro Meditation Institute. So maybe can you talk a little bit about what that is and your research into that and your experience on that?
So yeah, the neuromeditation idea is really taking a brain-based approach to meditation. And so this is a very Western way of looking at things, right? And I get that. But for me, the idea is that we understand at this point that different styles of meditation, different ways that you use your attention and intention affects the brain differently. So all meditations are not the same. They don't all do the same thing. There's some overlap for sure, but there's also some important differences. And so what we're trying to do is say, okay, let's identify these differences and set it up in a way that people can understand, in an easy way, an easy to understand way, like, okay, here's the basic approaches, and then figure out like, well, how might we use these specifically for certain concerns or certain goals? Again, it's a very Western approach,
Yeah.
but I do live in the United States, and the reality is most of the people that meditate are meditating for a reason. They're not just meditating for, they're not meditating for enlightenment. They're meditating because they want to sleep better or they want to be less anxious. And so it's like, well, are there certain meditation approaches that might be better geared for that? And I think the answer is yes. And so it's like, well, why not take advantage of what we understand, for those purposes?
So coming from this Eastern tradition, for example, I teach yoga and I'm into meditation, for spiritual purposes and things like that. You somehow, when I hear people talking about brain hacking, like figuring out a way to like a shortcut almost. In a way, it makes things easier, but also I guess it would be looked upon by the yogis as an irreverent approach,
Yeah.
and something that they would spend years or years of sadhana and like effort to acquiring, and then we just look at the brain patterns and the brain waves and find different ways of doing it, almost like a hack. I wonder what they would think of that. But then you almost made meditation into like prescriptive, like for different, like or you can't sleep, then this kind of meditation, or if you want to reduce stress, and it's this kind of meditation. So I find it very fascinating, and it's like a very interesting, I think. Can you tell us what neuro meditation is? Is that like your synthesis of all that you have learned, or is it like a new technique?
It's interesting because one of the things that we've done, for better or worse, is, we don't have, it is prescriptive in certain ways, but it's also not. And what I mean by that is we try to make the process very individualized and very developmentally appropriate for the person. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But so, for example, if somebody comes in and they say, "Oh, I've got anxiety. I want to learn to meditate because maybe that'll be helpful." Okay, great. We've got some ideas of what approaches to meditation might be best for that. So things that kind of fall in the mindfulness category, right? Where you're learning to separate yourself from your experiences so that you can look at them more objectively, right? So we know that practice is really good. It's really helpful for stress and anxiety. However, there's a million ways to do that.
Right.
And so, so we don't have, like some programs, it's like, here's the 8-week course, right? So first you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. We don't do that. So what we do is we offer people a range of different practices, and we try to work with them specifically to figure out like what's working for you, what's not working for you, where are you getting stuck, how can we facilitate this process for you? And I totally get the perspective, right? That from more ancient traditions, that it's like, okay, you're missing the point. And I totally understand that. My counter argument would be most of the people in the Western world. So I started in a Zen tradition. And his instructions were pretty much like, just sit,
Right.
you know. And I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do? You know, shut up, stop talking, stop thinking, and just sit. And it was like, okay, you know, and I did that for years, you know, and it was like, and I understand that tradition, but the reality is that there was only like 2 or 3 people ever in the Zendo, because people aren't going to just do that, right? Like, not in the Western world.
Yeah.
And so, like, you know, so my argument is that it's like, well, is it better to simplify the process a little bit and hold people's hands a little bit more so that they can get started on this process and start to learn what meditation has to offer? And what's interesting is, because even though we take it from a very secular perspective, right? It's not from a particular tradition. It's not, you don't have to believe anything in
Right.
order to do these practices. But what we find is that the people that really stick with it, eventually they start going down a spiritual route, and they may, you know, find some other path that is a better fit. So in some ways, for me, I feel like maybe what we offer is a little bit of a starting point for a lot of people. It's a way to get them oriented, to help them feel better quickly, and then get them oriented toward what meditation really has to offer if they really go deep.
Right. I actually like this argument that you made, because it's kind of sort of bringing down the barrier to entry. It's lowering the threshold and making it accessible to everybody else. Because in the past, definitely in the ancient system, only the student who was the fittest could go through after a lot of, passing a lot of tests. So I guess this is like more suited for the modern world in a way. So, well, there are so many things to unpack here. One is spirituality, because you said automatically these people experience a certain awareness of something larger, I guess, and sort of turn towards spirituality of their whatever their preference is. And also, the other part is feedback, neurofeedback, and how you incorporate that. So, okay, let's start with spirituality first. So, is that something, this belief in something greater and wanting to sort of experience transcendence, is that something very innate in consciousness, almost as if, I mean, I know what the Eastern traditions say, but I'm interested from a Western psychology and point of view.
Yeah, I think it probably is. I think it's probably an inborn, I don't know if desire is the right word, or longing, right? This like reconnection to whatever you want to call it, our true selves, our true nature, our self with a capital S rather than a small s, however you want to think about it. I think that is, and maybe that's what's causing so much distress right now in the world, right? Is that people have become disconnected from that larger aspect of who they, I don't want to say who they are, right? Because that's, but what they can connect to, recognizing that they're much bigger than they think they are, and that everything is interconnected. Again, all of the traditions say this. Every body, everything is interconnected. But, when we're in our crazy, busy lives, we don't see any of that. We don't experience it. We don't feel it. And so I think what may happen is that once people start to meditate, however they get there, whatever path they take, they start to quiet down all that chatter, and all of that noise. And then all of a sudden they start to have little tastes of that idea, right? That it's like, oh, there's much more here. I mean, that's true for my path, right? That it was like, oh, how did I get into this? It's like, well, when you start to have those little experiences, that's like, oh, there's a lot more. And I want to experience that. I want to be part of this. I want to connect to that. I want that to be a part of who I am, right? Not just something I ignore or pretend that isn't there. And so I think that's probably why, you see people start to move more into some sort of spiritual path. It's interesting. For a while, I was teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction at the University of Missouri when I was back there. And, this is one of those very, here's the 8 weeks. Here's what you do week 1. Here's what you do week 2. And every semester, I would have students sign up. They would sign up for the class, and then they would come up to me at the first class, and they would say, it was often Catholic, right? But there was other, they'd say, hey, Dr. Tarrant, I'm Catholic, and I'm worried that this class is going to go against my beliefs, right? And it was like, okay. And so I would always tell them, I'm like, well, if I ever say anything or suggest something that goes against your beliefs, obviously I want you to do what feels right for you, right? Like I don't,
Yeah.
ignore me. If it goes against your beliefs, do what's right. And what's funny is that by the end of the 8 weeks, these were the same students who would come up and go like, you know what? Like, not only did this not go against my beliefs, it actually enhanced my beliefs. It like made me a stronger Catholic or whatever it was. And I thought that was fascinating, right? That it's like,
Yeah.
and it wasn't just Catholicism, but there was a lot of that. Um, and so again, it almost didn't seem to matter what your belief system was. It's like if you start to tap in to that deeper space, uh, it it enhances your own spiritual beliefs and your own practices.
So does that mean that somebody who, let's say, experiences some form of transcendental, like experience, if he will the nature of the experience depend on his religious and spiritual background and belief? And so somehow maybe a Catholic would see us, maybe experience Jesus or Mary, or maybe a Hindu would experience somebody else. So that's very fascinating. The truth comes to you packaged in the form that that's palatable to you. And
Yeah,
that I find very, very fascinating. But you
yeah.
mentioned about your experiences before I get to neurofeedback. Can you tell us about how you got into this? Like, did you have any of your own personal experiences?
Yeah, I started getting into meditation. Gosh, it was probably in the early 1990s. And at the time I was living in Missouri in the United States, and there wasn't a lot of meditation stuff available at that time in that place. And I didn't even know really what it was, but there was just something about it that was attractive to me. And but I didn't really have, so I was reading books and things, but I really didn't have any practical experience. In college, I took a course on Hinduism and I took a course on Buddhism, and it made way more sense to me, than everything else I had looked at. But it was like, well, how do I do this? I don't know how to do this. And then I eventually found this Zen monk. He's actually a monk, but he was teaching at the university, and so I started sitting with him, and that was my first experience with meditation. But then things quickly developed, and I started practicing qigong and some other practices, some yoga, and really it was probably the combination of those things, but really started to feel uh, things like energy, right? So whether you call it chi or prana or whatever,
Yeah.
and started to experience that and feel it move through my body and activate certain things. And the groups that I was in started doing things like energy healing and things like this. And so to me, that just opened my mind immensely, because it's like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, clearly, if this is happening, then I'm not contained in this little body. I'm not entirely separate. I can have an impact on people around me. My thoughts and my intentions have a real impact outside of myself.
Right.
And so, I think for me, that was probably what really got me going on this path. I don't think it was meditation by itself, because for me, meditation was very much just like emptiness. It was just kind of like, I wasn't having transcendent experiences. I wasn't seeing rainbows and fireworks. It was very quiet.
Right.
But I assume that in conjunction that practice helped me to tune into the things like the energy from qigong and things like that, right? That it was, even though I wasn't really experiencing things I would have liked, I would have loved for some angelic being to show up in my, and be like, hey, Jeff, here's what we're going to do, like that
Yeah.
would be
Yeah.
great. But I have a different path, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. But did you actually manage to experience any healing personally or with somebody else using this quote unquote newfound powers that you started seeing?
Yeah, and of course, at that point, it's hard. We weren't like measuring stuff, right?
Yeah.
So it was, more people's subjective reports. But it was often very interesting, because we would often do this in a group, and we'd be doing all kinds of stuff because we were mixing qigong with shamanic practices and all kinds of other things, and everybody would be doing whatever they were doing. But it was interesting because somebody would come in and for a healing and lay down on the table, and we would do whatever we were doing. And, 9 times out of 10, whatever their thing was would feel much better by the end, right? And then, and then there was experiences where, um, for example, I was doing a healing practice one time, and I didn't even try for this. It's just the imagery that came up was sort of like roots extending down out of myself and moving through the earth toward this other person and connecting to them.
Hmm.
And that it was this sort of like earth healing energy that was kind of moving up through them. It was just kind of the imagery that came to me. I wasn't trying for that. And I didn't tell them or anybody else what was happening. And then afterwards, when we were debriefing, somebody asked them like, "Oh, what happened for you?" And they were like, everything that was coming up for them was nature related and with trees and things like this, right? And again, so you can't prove anything, but you start to have enough of those experiences
Right.
where things seem like they're connected. That it's like, okay, and there's a feeling that comes with it. If you've ever done this work, right? There's a feeling when you kind of lock in and there's something bigger happening. And so, again, it's a very subjective feeling, but when you feel it, you know it. And it feels very real. And it's hard to deny that.
When doing my own yoga practices, for example, I've sort of unintentionally sort of tapped into somebody else's mind field, as it were. For example, I was leading a class one day, and I knew exactly the words that one of the students in the first row was going to come and tell me at the end of the class, and he said those exact same words, and I surprised myself. And I started making a note of all these little anomalous phenomena. I mean, I knew, of course, I grew up in the tradition. I've been doing yoga for a long time, so I kind of know that these things happen and exist, but it's every time it happens, it's a surprise. It's every time it
Yeah.
happens, it's a surprise. It's like a reinforcement and reiteration of, and I wonder, but the frustrating part is it's never under my control. I can't command it to happen when I want, I can't like read
Yeah.
your mind when I want it. I mean, I'm sure there are people who can. So that's what I'm trying to jump, like I know that the potential exists in all of us, and there are ways to unlock it, to bring it under conscious volition and control. And this, to make this leap, is the biggest frustration. I think everybody's like going around in the dark, trying different things, opening different doors.
Yeah.
So speaking of different doors, did you find any particular modality that you find most suited for the kind of work that you're doing, or for a scientific study? Like I know that you studied Hinduism and yoga and Buddhism and Qigong and so many other traditions. Are they all equal in terms of their approach and effectiveness, or is there something that you prefer personally?
I mean, at this point, I don't think I feel like one particular system is better than another. One of the things which is frustrating for me personally, but also professionally, is that, one of the conclusions that I've kind of come to is that, big shock here, everybody's different. And so different things are going to work for different people. And so it's interesting, when we see different classes or workshops or things that it's like, everybody gets the same thing. And I understand, you have to have a format when you're teaching something. But it's interesting because when you do something like that, there'll be some students that open up and seem to tap in, and there's other students that seem to get nothing, and there's a bunch of people in the middle. And it's like, well, why does that happen, right? Like, why doesn't everybody respond? And it's like, well, everybody's different. And for me, I look at it because of my perspective. I look at it from the brain. And, if I hooked up your brain and measured it and I hooked up my brain, they're going to look very different.
Right.
And so from that perspective, why would I need the exact same thing that you need? Like we may need something different to get our brains out of the way, right? Our brains may be, inhibiting things in different ways. And so, is it more of a physical practice or an energetic practice, or is it using technology or brain hacking? What's going to be the thing that helps us get out of the way to tap into something bigger? So for me, I feel like it's the best approach is offering people a wide range of possibilities and then seeing what works, seeing if they can't find something that really locks in for them.
Right. Has anyone ever come to you saying, I mean, not about sleeping better or stress, but like I want to get psychic powers or I want to be able to do this? And is there something, has that happened? I mean, where is there a specific protocol? I mean, for the benefit of the viewers and for myself, like who's interested in unlocking through brain hacking.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I mean, I've been teaching an online class for the last several years, and I think I've taught one of the classes 10 times now, something like that. And we're using audio visual entrainment technology. So we're using technology, and for people listening that don't know what audio visual entrainment is, it's basically these glasses that have lights built into the eye set, and the lights flicker on and off at certain rates. And then you have headphones on that are matching that frequency. And what we know is that the brain will follow repetitive frequencies. So if you're flashing lights on and off 7 times a second, your brain will start making more 7 cycle per second brainwaves, which is theta, right? It'll follow along. So we can use that technology to kind of nudge the brain in certain directions. And so in the classes, what we do is, each week we do a different protocol, and I explain why, right? It's like we talk about, it's like, hey, from some of the psychics and mediums and healers that I've looked at, here's a pattern that seems to show up a lot. Let's use the technology and see what happens, right? Let's try it for ourselves.
Right.
And so they'll use that for a week. And then the next week we try a different protocol. And then the next week we do a different protocol. And what's interesting about that is, every week, it's kind of like I was just saying, every week, maybe half of the people really liked the protocol and felt like it was doing something for them and helping them tap in. And the other half are kind of like, I don't know. It was all right. But by the time we get to the end, virtually everybody has found at least one thing that seems to work for them. And then you will have people that will have kind of bigger experiences, right? Like something seems to unlock or open up in a big way. For most people, it's subtle, right? That they start noticing more synchronicities in their life, and they're feeling different and they're feeling more connected. And but then for other people, they have some sort of spirit communication experience or something where they're talking to a deceased loved one or whatever. And it's like, oh, okay. So it does seem like there are ways to use technology. It's just not a perfect science.
Right. Has the CIA ever knocked on your door? Because I know that, for example, I remember reading about Robert Monroe and how he was experimenting with different frequencies, and he had these out-of-body experiences, and this, I don't know, this hemisync and all these, like they set up this institute to study. And then I read about remote viewing and how they trained U.S. soldiers. They believed, and I think it's still true, holds true, that it's a skill that you can acquire through practice and training to be able to remote view or see things and experience these things. It's interesting you brought this the idea of the glasses with lights, because my introduction to neurofeedback, I want to get into that now, was a book that I read a long time ago called Mega Brain by Michael Hutchinson, where he was talking about different states of the mind associated with the alpha, beta, theta brainwaves. And then he spoke of there are these brainwave generators where you can listen to these audio frequencies, binaural beats. You play one frequency in one ear, another, and then your brain vibrates to the difference and so on. And I came across this idea called the Gansfeld effect, where I think it's similar to what you spoke of. So when the brain is isolated from any kind of a sensory input, it seems to sort of start hallucinating or visualizing. So is that the phenomenon that you were talking about? And then you also combine that with entrainment, with light frequency, right?
So actually, the Gansfeld is one of the protocols we use with the glasses. And the difference is that with Gansfeld, there's no flicker. It's just a constant light. And traditionally they use red as the light. And so that's what Gansfeld means, whole field, right? So the idea is that you can't see anything except red. And so that's interesting, right? Because at the same time, you're also listening to white noise or some variation of that. We've experimented with different variations of white noise, and we've actually found some things that seem to work better for people than just straight white noise. But so, yeah, if you think about it, it's a little bit like sensory deprivation, but it's almost the flip of that, where it's like sensory overload. So it's like you've got this like bright red light in your field of vision, and then you've got this noise in your ears, but there's no signal, right? So it's all noise. There's nothing there for your brain to lock onto.
Right.
And I think that's probably why that seems to be effective. There's loads of research looking at using the Ganzfeld with telepathy and show that people tend to do better with the Ganzfeld than without. We've been using it for things like spirit communication. So it's interesting because it does seem like, it does something to kind of open the brain up. It like knocks and actually, to take a step back, whether we're using the Ganzfeld or we're using a theta frequency or some left versus right hemisphere type of a protocol, I think really what we're doing in all those cases is we're knocking the brain out of its normal way of processing. So that, again, we're kind of getting the brain out of the way. So I don't think the brain is what's creating the psychic phenomena. I think the brain is actually getting in the way of it. And we have to kind of like bump the brain out of its normal processing so that we can hear or see or tap into more subtle information.
Right.
And so I think that's what all of these things are doing. And again, just different things work for different people.
Right. So in your studies, speaking of brainwaves, I know that there are specific brainwaves associated with different brain states and everything. Do you know what's the signature? Like we know what's the relaxed state. Like you can look at the monitor and probably tell when someone's relaxed, when someone's really aroused, and so on. So do you have these signature profiles for activation of some kind of psychic faculty, or a signature profile for transcendental experience? Probably have you ever tested on like an experienced monk who's having some kind of experience, and you kind of recorded the brain? Is it like a signature brainwave profile that you see repeatedly in many times in different people? Is that something that is reproducible?
Yes and no. It's a, apparently I can't just give a straight answer, but so it's interesting, right? Because there are certain frequencies that show up a lot, whether it's with certain meditative states or different psi abilities, right? So like theta shows up a lot. It's a very slow frequency. It's associated with the subconscious, with creativity. But then the very fast frequencies also show up too, like gamma. So those two frequencies are probably the most common, but they're not the only ones. The thing that seems to be more consistent are brain regions that are shifting the way that they behave. And so again, it's like what we see is that different people might shift the functioning in different ways. So one person might really ramp up activation in the right frontal lobe, and somebody else may shut it completely down. As far as transcendent states, it's interesting. Weirdly enough, I've never actually measured like a monk that's been sitting in a cave for 30 years or whatever, but it's interesting because I have some data for a few different people where instead of this brainwave activating and this brainwave activating, everything shuts down. Like everything. Delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, it all just drops. And I've seen this at least 3 times now. And one time was with this really well-known channeler in Slovenia. They had me out there to do some brain mapping with her while she channels these different beings, right? And, and that's always a hard one for me because I can't verify, if they're like, oh, I'm channeling angel, whatever. And it's like, well, I can't prove that, right? But what's interesting is every time she would channel, her brain would basically shut down. And at the same time, she's like saying all this like wisdom, right? Like everything comes out of her mouth is like pure wisdom. But her brain is like off, right? And so it's kind of like, okay, that's interesting. I've also seen that kind of a pattern where everything shuts down. I've seen it during certain healing modalities where, really the idea for the healer is to get into this sort of almost like unified state, like unified consciousness, where they're kind of like connected to everything, but they're out of the way. And then I've seen it with my very first Qigong teacher who was into shamanic stuff. And this was a long time ago. I didn't even know what I was looking at. But, in retrospect, everything just like fell. And when I asked him what he was doing, he said he was going to the void, right? So it's interesting that there seems to be some overlap with that pattern where everything drops out, where it's like people are really getting themselves out of the way. They're getting their consciousness completely out of the way. And so then whatever happens, right? For one person, other energies come through. For somebody else, they're in the void, which, I think from that perspective is sort of pure potential, right? Like the quantum field or something.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. We see these patterns, but they're not 100% consistent. Again, I think it's because there's different ways to get your brain out of the way. And some people do it that way. Some people are going to increase really slow brain waves like delta and theta. And then when those show up, it's almost like the brain went to sleep, right? So it looks different, but it could have a similar effect.
But do you think in a normal medical setting, let's say if somebody was on a medical bed and then was being monitored for some other condition, and if this happened with them, they'll probably be diagnosed as brain dead, do you think? Because of all the brain activity, is it consistent with lack of brain activity? Like when you say all the brain waves shut down, could it be mistaken?
Yeah, good question. So there's still brainwave activity, but it's so it's comparing to their own baseline, right? Is what I'm kind of doing, right? So
Okay.
it's like, when they're sitting there having a regular conversation and then they're channeling, everything drops out, in the channeling compared to having a regular conversation. There's still brainwave activity. It just dramatically decreases. So, there's still an EEG in there.
Okay.
It's just much quieter. Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So you're saying there is no independent standard that is equally applicable to all brains. You just calibrate each session for that person's brain. What is normal for that person's brain? What is sleep for that person's brain? And then you look at it according to that.
Yeah. Yeah. But because we do see certain patterns that show up repeatedly, so that's what we try to target, right? When we're trying to help people unlock things. But again, we don't know which one's going to work because we see a variety of patterns. So it's like, well, let's try a couple of them and see how that feels, right?
Yeah. So have you applied this in reverse? Like we know, like, okay, there are a few kind of patterns that are associated with transcendence. I know there's not like one particular signature. So in your course or your class, for example, when you use the glasses and these frequencies, maybe we try. I don't know if I'm saying this right. This transcranial magnetic stimulation and all these techniques where you can stimulate certain areas of the brain. So if you know that these regions are associated with certain activity along with these brainwave states, maybe it's possible to like get somebody to be, I don't know, close to enlightenment or give them a taste of some kind of transcendence and come back and report to us how it was.
Yeah,
Have you ever
exactly.
tried that before?
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that we're really focusing on now is using neurofeedback, because the nice thing with neurofeedback is, especially with some of the technology and equipment that has come out in the last few years, is it's much more flexible than it used to be. So, which means I can, in fact, I've got one of my favorite little system right here at the moment. It's very simple. It's a baseball cap.
Right.
And there's one electrode right here. So this is the outside.
Right.
It's held on by a magnet, but this is what the sensor looks like. And it's like little springy things. And what's nice is it's held by a magnet, so I can put it anywhere on the hat that I want. And so, we can set up various protocols and move that to the direct location that we're interested in. So, for example, one area that shows up a lot, we call the God spot. So it's the right parietal lobe back here, and seems to have a lot to do with boundaries between self and others. And so we can put that electrode right there and sort of give people auditory feedback while they're meditating to see if we can shut that part down, right? So either like getting really quiet with the brain waves or increasing the slow brain waves, like we said, like delta and theta, and then see, okay, what happens? Like what happens if we encourage that part of the brain to get out of the way, right? To do something different. So I think with neurofeedback in particular, because we can get very precise with the location or more precise, right? Than you can with like the glasses, you're not getting very precise. You're kind of hitting the whole brain.
Yeah.
other things that you can use. So whether it's, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation or transcranial direct current stimulation, you can use that on different parts of the brain, but you're a little bit limited. And you're certainly not dealing with specific brain waves, which might be important, right? We want certain brain waves to go up, certain ones to go down, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think the neurofeedback gives us a lot of flexibility on how to approach this. So this is an area that I'm actively investigating.
And is it a little bit like muscle memory, where when the person, like when you click onto that particular state, is he or she able to reproduce it on their own without? Because this has been my being a traditional yogi, whatever purist, I've always looked down upon using external crutches to achieve states which you should be able to independently achieve using your mind. But so I'm wondering, will this cause a dependency on technology, or will they be able to achieve it on their own once you remove the neurofeedback machine?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point and a good question. And for us, or for me anyway, the way that I think about it and the way that I hope it works is that what it's doing is it's helping people learn what that state feels like. So by getting the feedback, people are meditating or whatever they're doing, and they're getting this feedback about what's happening in their brain, right? That it's like, oh, you're there, you're not there. And really what I want to happen is for people to recognize like, oh, that's what it feels like when I'm in the desired state, right? And so then over time, what I hope happens is that you don't need the equipment, right? Because you know what it feels like. And that's kind of what we want, right? So the idea is that it's not supposed to replace meditation. You still have to meditate. The technology is not going to make you a yogi. It's not going to make you an advanced meditator. It's just a tool to help you become more aware of your internal state. And that's it, right? And so you still have to do the work. And hopefully you don't become dependent on the technology. Hopefully you just use it as a tool to learn and maybe speed up the learning process a little bit.
Right. So where does one buy a hat like that? I mean, is this something that's available, or is it just a research tool that you have now?
No, so I'm working with a company called Divergence Neuro, and that's the software company. And then what they've done, which I think is clever, because they set this up as sort of a remote training process. So like I've got students all over the world, right? Because I can basically log into my computer and see their protocol, but they're running it at home, off of their phone. So it's Bluetooth wireless. They're running it on their phone, but it all connects to my app, right? And so that allows a lot of flexibility with training too, that, so there's various equipment that works with the software. This particular cap is called the Calibri, and it's from a company called BrainBit. And so BrainBit has several different types of caps. Some of them have like 4 channels or 8 channels. So if you really want to get complicated, you can measure lots more areas of the brain. For most of what we do, 1 channel works just fine. Right. So, and it's easy, so that's one of the reasons I like it. I use this probably 3 or 4 times a week and myself. And partly the reason I use it is because it's easy. Right. You put the baseball cap on, you wiggle the thing around, you put an ear clip on, hit go, and you're ready to roll. So it is available, and it is something that, people can do.
Okay, that makes it really accessible. Now, before I move on to the sort of the last section of our conversation today, I just want to quickly, just to finish off this neurofeedback, what is its application when it comes to pathology? Like when it comes to people suffering from, I don't know, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or depression, is there some applications? First of all, have you studied the brain waves and, the activity of people like that? And can entrainment in neurofeedback be used in those kind of circumstances to achieve a lasting cure, so to speak?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's actually how I got into neurofeedback. I'm a psychologist. And so I got into neurofeedback 25 years ago, really in my role as a psychologist, because the way that and actually I think there's some overlap between the way I think about working with somebody who's got anxiety or PTSD or ADHD or whatever, as well as these other kind of states like meditation and psychic development. And the overlap is that the brain gets rigid. That's what the brain does. It gets stuck. And that's the way that I think about things like, whatever, pick something, right? Depression. So if I look at the brain with somebody who's depressed, there's certain patterns that are fairly common, and so if we see that pattern and the person says, I'm depressed, there's a pretty good chance that there's a connection between those things. And so we can target those specific brain patterns associated with depression and try to get them to shift. And really what I think we're doing is we're creating flexibility. The brain is like stuck in a pattern that's no longer helpful. And so we're saying like, okay, can we teach the brain to do something different? Can it be more adaptive? Can it be more flexible? And when it starts to do that, then guess what? The symptoms usually start to go away. Now, is it permanent? It depends. What you see sometimes is that for many people, it does end up being more or less a permanent shift. But of course, if we're thinking of it in terms of the brain getting rigid, well, what's to stop the brain from getting rigid again, right? Like it could be, a year down the road and they have some sort of stressor in their life and the brain goes back to that old pattern, right?
Yeah.
So, that can happen. But I think it's the same issue. In some ways, it's the same issue with meditation or with psychic development, which is that the brain is stuck in some sort of a pattern that's getting in the way. And so it's like, well, how do we teach the brain to be more flexible, right? And this is one of the hallmarks of people that are like really, really expert meditators, is that their brain is very flexible.
Yeah.
Right. They can shift states kind of at will. And, I think that's maybe that's the definition of health, of like brain health, is flexibility. Right. And so that's what we want.
Yeah, that's similar to body, even yoga, like, a flexible body as opposed to like somebody who goes to the gym and works out a lot of muscles, but is stiff, So I want to just quickly move to the last bit of my conversation is your involvement with the telepathy tapes.
Yeah.
And what was your involvement? And did you kind of discover something new? Because I did sort of understand based on my conversation with Diane Powell also about how the ability to do these kind of, like telepathy and, like communication without words is sort of latent in everybody at birth. But somehow with the development of the verbal faculties, certain, like when people start expressing themselves through words, there are certain areas of the brain that get sort of suppressed and are not active anymore. I mean, that's one theory, I guess. Was that your finding, or like did you find anything else, any clues about why telepathy may exist and how it works? And how how anybody can start using it, like make it work for them?
Yeah, so my initial role with the telepathy tapes was to do the brain mapping. So to, hook them up to a 19-channel EEG and record their brainwave activity during these telepathy exercises to see if we could learn anything. And, we've got some interesting data. It's preliminary. It's difficult to get good data with this population because many of them have pretty significant apraxia, so they don't have very good control over their motor movements. And so if you're moving around a lot and vocalizing, it's going to make the EEG really messy. So it's a little bit difficult to get good data. We did get good data on at least a couple of people. But, excuse me. And of course, since then, we've continued to do more sophisticated research. And so we're in the middle of a study right now. We're going to go collect a bunch of data in a couple of weeks, a week and a half. And it's not really doing the brain imaging, but it's really trying to set up as tight of controls as we can to address a lot of the critics, right? A lot of the critics came out and said, oh, this is cueing, or the answer is coming from the communication partner or whatever. And so we're trying to set up some protocols that address all of those things so that we can, try to demonstrate this as scientifically rigorously as possible. But to get to your question, like what the heck's going on here? And is there anything that, the rest of us can take away from this in terms of our own development? I think there's a couple of things. I mean, certainly there seems to be something related to language, because obviously all of these folks in the telepathy tapes are non-speakers. Some of them may be minimally vocal, but for the most part, they communicate by pointing to a letterboard or typing on a keypad or something like that. So they're not using language the same way that we are, or sort of, folks who don't have apraxia or have, autism in this way. And so I think there's something important there, right? Because one of the things there's a couple of things that are relevant. One, I think when we start using language, what we're doing is we're creating limitations just by using our words. So when we apply words to something, we've changed the nature of what it is. Anytime you use words, you've already messed up the nature of something. And in fact, a lot of different spiritual traditions will say, like, you can't use words to describe God, because as soon as you put words on God, you've limited God, and God is limitless. So,
Right.
so you can't talk about God, right? And it's like, I think there's an important lesson there, right? That it's like, well, but they're not using words that way, right? So I think they're more in the pure experience of what exists, and which is a much more right hemisphere type of way of being. Left hemisphere is much more language oriented. So they're way more in their right hemisphere. The other thing that's interesting, there was a study that came out a couple of years ago, and it was looking at the corpus callosum, which is, a connective structure in the brain connecting the right and left hemispheres. And what they found is that when you're using your left hemisphere, when you're really locked into language, the corpus callosum actually limits your ability to access the right hemisphere. It kind of shuts off the right hemisphere. It's kind of like, no, I'm over here, right? And so I think this is where there's some lessons for us, right? Like if we want to develop our own abilities, seems like we got to learn how to shut off that analytical, language-oriented part of our brain, which is consistent with what you hear. It's consistent with what you hear from mediums, when they're like, don't censor yourself. Just say whatever comes through. Don't think about it. Don't analyze it. Just say it. Even if it sounds crazy, just say it. Well, you're trying to stay in the right hemisphere. Or with remote viewing, they talk about the analytical overlay. Right? That's left hemisphere. It's like when your brain comes in and starts to interpret, that's when you mess it up. Right? So instead of interpreting, just say what you see. And so I think the lessons that we're learning from them are already out there, right? It's just sort of validation for why those are so important.
Right. Wow. I mean, I'm really, really, this is something that really gets me, like, there's so much to get into. I mean, this could, like, be on a podcast of its own, like, how language and, saying it changes and affects the nature of things, and how we sort of contain and constrict, things by giving them names. In fact, I don't know if it's like there's this concept in Buddhism and even in Hinduism of nama rupa, or names and forms. Like, by labeling something, like what exists, at least in Hinduism, what it's believed is what exists, the ultimate reality is just this field of undifferentiated consciousness. And then it sort of, as it comes down, it achieves, sort of solidifies into form, and then we give it name. A tree is a tree because we all agree that it is a tree. And a being is a being, like an ant or an animal or a human being. And it sort of words tie things down and give it form. And so it kind of makes a lot of sense, and there's a whole lot of a lot of discussion to be had there, but which we won't get into today. But I'm glad you touched upon that. But yeah, so what before we close out, what does the research path for Dr. Tarrant look like? Like, what are you headed towards? Is it more of the same? Anything new? Any new books or new research coming up?
Yeah, so the telepathy research we're doing is going to be very exciting, because what we're going to be asking some of these non-speakers to do is to engage in telepathy exercises in separate rooms from the sender, which is really what we need in order to get really, really good data. It's much harder for a lot of reasons, but it seems like it's important to look at that. So that's going to be coming up. There's some other projects that are kind of in the works, so we'll see where those go. One of the things I'm very interested in right now is some of what we've been talking about. Like, can we get a little bit more clarity on using these technologies as a way to unlock some of these abilities? And then also on the flip side, I've been seeing more and more people who have had spontaneous spiritual awakenings and are having a really hard time integrating that into their daily life. So it's like too much and they can't turn it off. So it's almost the opposite problem, right? Like they're too open. And so trying to come up with ways to help them become more grounded and rooted and back in their bodies. So I'm interested in exploring that as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. So, on that note, I think we'll have to stop the conversation for today. So, Dr. Tarrant, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so
Sounds
much for your
good. Yeah,
time.
I appreciate it. Thank
Yeah.
you.